Good evening. My name is Mark Lysett. I'm the director of the Center for International Studies and the Program on the Global Environment. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the event in our 50th anniversary series, Thinking Globally, International Studies and the Global Turn in the Social Sciences. Tonight we are especially pleased to present the first of our Dialogues series, bringing researchers into conversation on the scales, forms, and stakes of global scholarship. Recent approaches to globalization, climate change, inequality, and more have underscored the importance of critical knowledge on the processes and problems that interlink people and regions across the planet. Through its lectures and events, this series explores the history, politics, and prospects of this global turn in the social sciences and highlights the distinctions between thinking globally and thinking internationally. Upcoming events will feature Joe Masco and Trevor Paglin in conversation on global surveillance, Arjun Appadurai and a panel of Chicago faculty on the past and future of area studies, Sonali Thakkar and Rajana Khanna on post-coloniality and the global, and Ursula Heise and a panel of University of Chicago faculty on the Anthropocene. For more information, please visit cis.uchicago.edu or like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Okay? Please join our conversations as this series explores the genealogy and the promise of the global as a frame for scholarly thought. Today, however, we are thrilled to host Professor Karin Noor-Cetina and Professor Alex Preda, who will be speaking on their innovative research on global financial markets. We'll begin tonight with a conversation with our featured speakers, followed by an opportunity for the audience to join the discussion. After the Q&A period, we'll adjourn into the lobby where wine and other refreshments await, and the conversation can continue. It has disappeared at the moment, but we will have a microphone in the center aisle. So we ask that as you prepare to ask questions of our speakers, that you gather in the center aisle and use the microphone, and that way our recording will be able to pick up your questions. Okay? All right. First, let's introduce our speakers. Alex Preda is Professor of Accounting, Accountability, and Financial Management at King's College London, and currently a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. Professor Preda's research interests include strategic behavior in financial markets, decision-making and cognitive processes in electronic anonymous markets, market automation and trading technologies, valuation processes in markets, the role of communication in decision-making processes, the public understanding of finance, and the governance of global finance. His publications include Framing Finance, the Boundaries of Markets and Modern Capitalism, and Information, Knowledge, and Economic Life, an Introduction to the Sociology of Markets. Professor Preda is joined by Karin Noor-Cetina, Otto Borchert Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology, Anthropology, and of the Social Sciences in the college, and Chair of the Sociology Department at the University of Chicago. Her research interests span financial markets, knowledge and information, as well as globalization theory and culture. Currently, she is working on a book that examines global foreign exchange markets and post-social knowledge societies. She continues to do research on the information architecture of financial markets, on their global microstructures, the global and social cultural forms that these markets take, and on trader markets in contrast to producer markets. Her previous books include Epistemic Cultures, How the Sciences Make Knowledge, and Manufacture of Knowledge, an essay on the constructivist and contextual nature of science. Together, Professor Noor-Cetina and Professor Preda have edited the Handbook of the Sociology of Finance and the Sociology of Financial Markets. Please join me in welcoming them here tonight. I want to begin our conversation tonight with a question that invokes the theme of our anniversary series and ask, first, what is the role of the national, or perhaps the state, in studying new global markets? And following on that, what kind of globalization is produced through the emergence of global financial markets?
Should I start? Maybe I'll start with some PowerPoints and at the same time say that it's a pleasure for me to be here and to have this opportunity, and I hope to learn from you as much as you will learn from me. I have prepared a few slides just to, not a lot of explanations, I took everything out. That makes it more scholarly, but you can see a little bit how these markets operate. So I study currency markets, which are the largest markets, by far the largest markets worldwide, with $5.3 trillion daily turnover when they were last measured, and not really suffering from the financial crisis, as you can see. You know, it goes up and up and up and up, more and more and more turnover. And these markets are traded over the counter, and that's already a bit of an answer to your question about the role of the state. The state has disappeared in this setup. Of course, it's currencies. Currencies are related to nation states, but currency markets are always between states. And now they are traded on a global level, basically in a very concentrated form, in 3 to 4 major countries. That is England, London, that's New York, and that's Tokyo, and that's also Switzerland to some degree. So Zurich is also in the picture. About 78% of all the trading and all the currencies come from these countries and are traded by banks in these countries. But they trade with each other across space, and the setup is something like that. Traders on trading floors of big banks trading with each other. Through Reuters and other firms, but mainly Reuters actually, the trading is electronic. It's done through the screens, and what trades are done is immediately on the screen. So it's a very reflexive setup. But the state is not in there, and I will just leave it with that for the moment. The state has set these markets free after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in the 1970s, when we had fixed exchange rates. These fixed exchange rates led to economic problems, as they do now in Greece, for example. Greece is bound to the euro and cannot adjust a nation-state currency downwards when it would be needed for economic reasons. It has set the markets free and hasn't interfered much, in spite of some attempts to do that. They are not traded on exchanges. The state usually controls exchanges better. The Security and Exchange Commission has access to data from the exchanges and can request data from the exchanges. It cannot request data unless there is a criminal investigation, from banks like UBS or Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley. It has no supervisory function, which it has for exchanges. So some markets, not all markets, but particularly those that are traded over the counter, as it is called, not in exchanges, are relatively independent from the state. Nonetheless, in this case, what was the full sentence, you ask? I don't know whether this already belongs here or should come later. Nonetheless, states can turn these markets off, as they have done during the Bretton Woods system, for example. They can just stop currency trading. They could, but they wouldn't do a favor to themselves. So they treat these markets, as Luhmann once said in German, mit spitzen Fingern, you know, like you just don't interfere too much, you know, because if you interfere too much, you may create havoc in the rest of the economy. So the state has, since the Peace of Westphalia in the 18th century, has the power to has the sovereign power, to eliminate these markets or to let them happen. But of course, eliminating them would have consequences for the economy. So it doesn't do it, and it doesn't do much supervision. Although they are trying after the financial crisis to do that more.
Okay. Alex, would you like to?
I think, first of all, let me thank you for having me here tonight and having this conversation. I think there are some aspects or dimensions which could be added to what Karin has just said. If you look at it in a historical perspective, the stock markets, for instance, have been a state creation and have been closely associated with nation states until well into the 20th century. If you look at all the grand buildings in London, Paris, New York on Wall Street, stock exchanges were understood as expressions of state power and of the economic development, financial development related to the nation state. But I think that what we are witnessing, it's not since yesterday, these are developments started already in the mid-1980s. We are witnessing the creation of a technological infrastructure which goes way beyond the boundaries of the nation state and which cannot be fully controlled by the nation state. One of the first instances from the mid-1980s, and I think it was 1986, was when the stock exchange in Singapore started trading US Treasury bills, and this forced, because of a time difference, difference in time zone, of course, this forced traders on the New York markets in Philadelphia to work at night first in order to keep up, but that proved very impractical, and then the introduction of computerized trading was a measure taking exactly in order to deal with this problem of technical coordination. And since then, we've seen the development of the technological infrastructure going now to microwave transmission of data, which goes, as I said, beyond the boundaries of a nation state, and which can be only partially regulated by the regulatory entities of nation states. And this sort of infrastructure which supports, and it is intrinsic to financial markets, to global financial markets, has become something quasi-autonomous. As I said, it is operated partly, and it expands all the time into a truly global infrastructure, disconnected at the same time from the usual infrastructure of the telecommunications industry. It's a dedicated infrastructure dedicated to conducting financial transactions, and which expands globally. We have connections from Chicago, microwave connections from Chicago to New York. We have microwave connections from London to Frankfurt. A microwave connection from New York to London is in planning, as is one from New York and Chicago to Tokyo. So we are witnessing nowadays the emergence of a dedicated infrastructure which is completely uncoupled from other communicational infrastructures used for other kinds of other types of communication. And this is also indicative, I think, of the fact that we do indeed witness the emergence of global markets as a sort of autonomous entity which is only partly subjected to regulatory requirements or regulatory efforts of the level of a nation state.
I'd like to follow that up with some more discussion of globalization, and particularly in two ways. And we'll start here. How do current theories of globalization account for or fail to account for these kinds of markets and these kinds of developments of autonomous systems?
So if I should start this, then they are, of course, aware that electronic communication and information structures play a role. Often they are aware this awareness is not enough because they don't look at the actual practices. For example, the theories that have a strong component that points to the technology tend to think in terms of network structures because they think of these infrastructures as involving pipes, underwater pipes from one continent to another, which is correct, which is how they started out. But they don't think in terms of what actually happens in the interaction between human traders and these technologies. So they see the technological infrastructure and generalize from this infrastructure to claim that everything is networks. Now, everything is not networks, and one can show that when one looks. So in that sense, for example, they are wrong. Many of these theories are wrong because they generalize immediately without closer look at what's actually happening on a behavioral level. They are not wrong, but they are focusing on something else. When they talk about globalization, these are usually theories from the bottom, from the local to the extended. So they look at how something that used to be local, maybe a McDonald's was at one point, a US only, or even in the US, in a particular region, and then it expands to the world, becomes a global company. And so it's this sort of understanding that things expand from one country to another, and in that sense, globalization proceeds. There's also a top-down theory. There are several top-down theories, which I personally find somewhat more interesting, actually, like the John Mayer theory in Stanford that would say that actually what happens locally is explained by global scripts expanding, traveling across the globe. So there's an isomorphism. When a new nation state sets itself up on some island, it takes the script of how nation states are constituted and sort of follows it. Not exactly, but basically. So you see all these nation states having the same institutions and the same regulations and similar, let's say, similar rules and regulations. And so what they do locally is not explained by their history or something, their politics from previous times, but rather by the dissemination of these scripts. Again, that doesn't really do much for us when we look at these markets, because it is, while there might be, it's hard to say there are global scripts involved because it's a unitary. It's a unitary domain, trading with each other from the very beginning and evolving from other trading domains rather than from some dissemination of scripts and analogous setups. So I think they are not looking at what we have called to some degree micro-globalization, this sort of globalization that is really based on practices and micro-social interactions between participants, whether the participants are traders, human traders, or algorithms, and brings together a domain that spans the globe in the sense of spanning all three time zones, not territorially, but time zones. It leaves out much of the world. It leaves out almost everything of the world, but it has its home in global cities and it spans the time zones, and in this case, that's the sort of globalization which emerges, which is really temporal, based on temporal notions rather than on territorial notions.
Can you explain what happened at Davos in reference to income inequality? And we're talking about serious things going on. And none of this was discussed.
In Davos here?
It was pushed off into a conference?
Yeah, okay, yes. So that, what does it show, in your opinion? These markets continue undeterred and don't watch Davos very much. And Davos doesn't watch the markets that much. Also, it has a bit of a look at them because it influences what goes on in nation states. the value of a currency has an immediate impact on national economies.
Alex, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in.
I tend to concur here with what Karen has just said. First of all, that the way financial markets, global financial markets work today seems partially at least decoupled from what is going on, on a whole series of levels, decoupled from other aspects of what we would call social life and political life. And indeed, if you look at the ways these other domains of life impact markets, it's mostly either via events which provide opportunities for strategic action and for trading, all the news releases, press releases, and so on and so forth, or for in the search for what market actors would call regulatory arbitrage, finding discrepancies in regulation which allows them to identify new opportunities for profit. But otherwise, I do not think that markets in their functioning nowadays, in the way they work, global markets are very much coupled with other social and political issues. And they don't cover, indeed, they are global, but they are not coextensive with globality in this geographical sense. They don't cover the entire world in the geographical sense. They cover particularly significant, they connect or bring together particularly a couple of very significant sites. But that's about it. And they're expanding indeed, and we can witness, for instance, the emergence, especially in Asia, the emergence of new significant sites for global finance. And we are in this process of witnessing this emergence. But otherwise, the process of decoupling, which I have mentioned in relationship to technology and to the creation of dedicated of a fully dedicated infrastructure, this is continuing.
We have literally an international problem. The Israelis are, producing water. Nobody else is replicating this sort of tradition anyway. The aquifers in the United States are basically depleted. You have Michigan right now, Flint. They have aquifers that Nestle is running there. We have some really serious problems, and nobody's talking about it. The Bushes are connected to South American markets of water. There are other connections too, corporate. I'm 72. These kids out here are going into a society that is declining very fast. If there isn't change, they're going to be fighting over water and oil like out of Mad Max movie.
So this might be a good moment to ask what the relationship is between the kinds of markets you study and commodity markets, and the kinds of markets in which elements of nature might be commoditized. Water, for example.
Well, so it can be commoditized in different ways. For example, oil and gas, natural gas, is transported. So it's a commodity, a physical commodity from Norway, for example, to England. And when you sit in front of a screen and you play with your orders, or you buy oil or you sell gas, you are sending something literally through pipes that you cannot fetch it back. It's gone. No? It arrives there. So this is part of it. The other is commodity speculation. So when you speculate on the price of oil, when you speculate on the price of natural gas, then you are in these financial markets, really. And then it's a question of the kind of instrument that exists. You know, is it futures? Is it options on the oil price? For example, so the primary, if the question is about the primary and the secondary economy of financial markets, then there are areas where it's very connected. Lufthansa, for example, has hedged against the oil price rising usually, because it has been rising for the last, so it was hedging against the rising oil price by buying options. And that would allow it, you know, to get the oil delivered at a lower price at a later point in time, and it could do that via financial markets. So the linkages between commodity markets depends on what we are talking about, whether we are talking about physical markets, which are also called markets and commodity markets, or speculative markets. And the speculative markets, the connections vary and depend on particular situations. They are not always depend on whether the instrument is a derivative and is based on, you know, a real commodity, like pork bellies in Chicago. You know, who needs pork bellies? But they are being traded as, you know, a speculative, a financial instrument, really. Even art pictures have been. The art market has been financialized to the degree where it is not a question of actually obtaining the picture, buying it or selling it, but speculating on its price. And you don't care what it looks like, you don't care, you know, where it is, it may be in some warehouse, and you speculate on the price. And then it's a question of financial derivative, financial instruments that are based on these physical pictures and commodities.
Okay. And can I ask that we please hold questions till the end of the presentation? I want to turn to an element of Alex's research now, and that's retail trading. Retail trading has grown alongside the global market in currencies, yet people don't make money as retail traders, right? What are we to make of this massive growth of this particular form of large-scale economic participation? And if retail trading is not about making money, what is it about?
Yes, thank you. I think indeed that is a very good question, because we are witnessing now a somewhat paradoxical phenomenon in that we have more and more so-called, I wouldn't call it popular, more and more ordinary people engage in financial transactions with relatively high frequency, but all the data available, and there's plenty of studies, quantitative studies around showing that in the long run, retail traders are not making money. And while this happens, we are not really witnessing any sort of decrease in the number of retail traders. I think I have a few slides that I have just once. I'm going to try and skip through this, show you one slide at the back with some data on retail trading. Yep. We have now a formal legal definition of retail trading, so it means trading about 5 times per week and more. We have some data from 2011, a study done by a consultancy based in Boston, iTech Group, showing that the daily volume is at that time was 3.9 trillion. And I've got here some data from 2013. The number of individual trading accounts on the Shanghai Stock Exchange is over 114 million. This is indicative of the degree of engagement in financial markets, which goes beyond institutional engagement. Traditionally, we have a phase, at least in Western Europe and North America, starting in the 1960s, when individual investors are replaced by institutional investors, such as pension funds, mutual funds, later hedge funds as well, investment banks and so on and so forth. But what we are observing since maybe the late 1990s, with the advent of a series of technological changes, is that more and more individuals engage in financial transactions, and not sporadically, that's the interesting phenomenon, but with a certain regularity. So they are not identical with the old-fashioned investors who might buy and sell a particular stock and then keep it in their account for a longer period of time. And in spite of this engagement, there is no statistical evidence that these retail traders are actually benefiting financially from their engagement. All studies indicate that they lose money. So the paradoxical fact here is, why do we have growing engagement when there is no financial benefit from it in the last instance? And I would say that this has to do with, with a couple of shifts in the way the nature of work and the nature of engagement in economic activities have been perceived recently. What I mean to say with this is the following. Any sort of engagement in an economic activity implies a moral choice, such as, for instance, what does it mean to produce value? Is producing value important? And traditionally in industrial and post-industrial societies, in service societies, organized work has been, be it industrial work or be it service work in the service sector. Organized work has been related to the notion of value creation, of producing something. But we see that nowadays this notion becomes more and more eroded in relationship with the economic transformations we are witnessing in the economy at large, the emergence of a so-called sharing economy, the Uberized economy, the tendency to shrink organizations, and the tendency to outsource a whole series of jobs in various sectors. This also has put into question, at least to some extent, this notion that organized, or the relationship, the link between organized work and the production of value. And if you talk to retail traders, as I have done repeatedly, one can see that this link is put into question, and more engagement in financial markets is seen as a meaningful activity in relationship to exactly this sort of loss of meaning of organized work. So it's seen as a substitute for the loss of meaning generated by transformations in the nature of organized work. And I think this has something to do with, this can explain at least to some extent the paradoxical fact that such retail traders engage in activities which ultimately are not profitable, but at the same time, there is still a form of economic participation, which is seen to a certain extent more and more as an, as an acceptable choice, as an acceptable moral choice nowadays when compared with engagement in organized work.
Karin, would you like to respond?
I think he's the world expert on retail traders, but and I certainly agree with what you said. I would also add that, but I don't actually know how they are counted. So the more financial professional traders you have, these people, when they stop trading, and they stop trading relatively early, they trade privately, so they trade as retail traders. However, I actually do not know whether they trade just 5 times a week or more often, but it could very well be that they enlarge, and they usually have money available, so they know about, you cannot lose all of it, you have to have some of it. and they have it available and play around in financial markets, and they enhance this group. They make it larger, and they know something about financial markets, but once they are private, they trade from home, and they don't have the big technology, they don't have access to the speedy data, they don't do high-frequency trading and things like that.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just very shortly, certainly if you look at it like this, you cannot say that from a technological point of view or from a financial point of view, retail traders could compete with institutional, with professional traders. Definitely there are significant differences here in the level of access to information or level of access to technology and even level of access to financial resources. That's absolutely true, but I think it's indeed paradoxical to see that this willingness to engage, and even more and more when actually not much is gained financially from this engagement in the end.
Okay. Now, in your work, it's clear that the global is something which is made and experienced through concrete sets of practices and technologies and institutions and so on. What's unique to the way that global financial markets make the global as a kind of experienced reality?
Well, so there's a number of things that are unique. Sociologically speaking, interestingly unique, and not just because they have certain kinds of technologies. And one thing I think is that there is a sort of level of integration in these global markets. Then but even now that they are very much based on algorithms, and that's that there is some sort of attentional integration. Everyone trading watches the markets. They don't know who the others are. The traders I interviewed, 99% of them I don't really know. I know a few of them, but I don't know all of them. So you get a level of integration that is like in the Schützian image I have used sometimes in my work, watching a bird in flight together and growing all together as you watch a bird in flight or an airplane. And that sort of watching the market together, knowing the other is there and is also watching, is an interesting form of global integration. It doesn't rely on you understanding the other. Also, in these markets, you have one language, and that's English. So as long as you trade, it's English. But it doesn't rely on you figuring out who is the other. You're taking into account culture and all these things. You don't have to know that. All you have to know that they are also connected. They are also watching the market. And you see signs of whoever them is, doing something on screen. The screen is the mediating device. And it brings the whole market world into your floor, on your trading floor. It's an interesting form of globalization. It's not firms going and selling things that they sell here also in China. It's of course selling, it's also selling involved, but it's a level of integration that is very much on that level of consciousness, of being aware, of having an awareness of others doing the same thing and seeing symbolic signs of what they are doing and of imagining what they might be doing. There's a lot of imagination involved in that. And I think that's a very interesting level. There's sometimes not many people involved. If you have professional traders in one market, there may just be 300, 400, 500 on a global level. Retail accounts is different. There are millions of them. So this formation of what one could call a global microstructure, something that holds together, also there's nothing there that holds it together. Other than the awareness, this observatory, the observatory of human or algorithmic traders watching what goes on in the market and responding to it. So I see the whole thing as a sort of response system that's based on the presentation, the presentation of the market visually, previously at least visually on screen. Is that an answer?
Yeah, that's a good answer, Alex.
Well, I would say among others that there's definitely this element of temporal coordination in the emergence of and functioning of global financial markets. That's when we are talking about the experienced reality. But this experienced reality also consists, at least in the sector I've been looking at, that of retail traders, you know, in the emergence of how shall I put it now? Various groups and quasi-communities based on particular interests, and communities or groups which transcend spatial barriers. Let me give you an example I had from my research where we had, I've encountered a group of there were 6 traders retail traders in this group, and the group was very structured. There was a master there who was based on the East Coast, and there was an apprentice who was based in London, and there were some other members of the group who were scattered throughout the southern United States, and some of them in Central America. And the master and the apprentice had developed together a trading machine, an algorithm or trading robot, and they had given it to the group to use, among others, also in order to see how the robot behaved in markets. None of them was a professional trader. Actually, the majority of the members of the group didn't even have a college degree. Only 2 of them had. And all these people worked together, although they were living in different time zones and had different professions, right? But they were every day on the instant messaging system exchanging information about the algorithm they were using, and some of them building, but also exchanging private information. At some point, because I observed them over a longer period of time, several months, the apprentice told me we are like a big family now. What I mean to say here is that, and this makes also a point while this kind of transactional activities are adopted by retail traders, because they contribute in their own way to the emergence of these global groups, I would say, or global communities, which might not be very large in number, but which show themselves as capable of, performing collaborative activities irrespective of space barriers.
Let me follow up on that and ask we talked about meaning and work and these kinds of global organizations which are not localized, right, but yet function as something like a firm or something like a community. How are work, the firm, basic units of social and economic organization being made and remade in these processes?
Well, I broached previously upon this issue of organized work and the moral choice of creating value in relationship or within settings of organized work. But let me give you another example now of how some firms I've encountered, financial firms, are organized. First of all, if you look at bigger firms, let's take a couple of European stock exchanges. That's my exhibit number 1. If you look at the Madrid Stock Exchange or the Milan Stock Exchange, they have their offices in Madrid and Milan respectively, but all the servers, all the computer, the hardware is in London. The firm isn't located in one significant firm or significant institution such as the Madrid Stock Exchange. Stockholm's the same. The Swedish Stock Exchange isn't located in one place anymore. You have some offices here, but the core piece of technology, the most important thing, the server, is in a completely different place. So we see here in the emergence of these global firms a sort of functional differentiation and distribution across different time zones. And now my exhibit number 2, a smaller brokerage firm, European again, which I've worked with in my ethnographic research. The firm was incorporated in some Caribbean island for tax purposes. The lawyers were in Israel. The management offices were in Southern Europe, and the chief programmer was in Vladivostok. You can see here how such a firm stretches out and functionally differentiates across various time zones, and all the coordination is done temporarily. Right? And this loosens, I think, this type of new global firm, which doesn't mean just, it's not isomorphic with a corporation being headquartered, let's say, in Chicago, and having branches and offices in various cities, right? Where everything is coordinated from one place, headquarters. Right? It's a different type of global firm where you have a functional differentiation of various activities and the spreading out various activities, acting strategically at the same time, taking advantage of various taxation systems and so on and so forth, but where all coordination is done temporarily. And I've seen often people from the management staying awake at night because they had to coordinate with Vladivostok. So the entire rhythm of work changes.
One concept here that comes out of anthropology that one could see as analogous is that of distributed cognition. So that cognition is so individualistic, but it's knowledge parts in that firm that are distributed over the globe and need to be coordinated. And the firms have that. The firms have that structure in the meantime. Of course, that depends on what you're looking at. So the global banks still have the traditional structure.
At this point, I want to turn to one final question before we turn things over to the audience. And that's really about the larger implications of your research for other kinds of domains. Mm-hmm. And that really has two parts. But the first thing I want to ask is, how is the understanding of global markets, the architecture of global markets, the sociology of global markets, how is that generalizable across other apparently different or separate global domains?
So my answer would be that in the case of what Alex just talked about, you can find incidences of that looking not so different already in place in areas like gaming competitions, where it's a question of game playing or sports that are played electronically. These players and the audience and the observers and the programmers watching some of these things, can be in very different locations, and yet they are brought together via the electronic medium and for particular occasions. So this is a slightly different structure because it's event-related, whereas this is not so event-related. In the gaming case, it's event-related, but you have these distributed structures that are not so different. The case of the global currency markets, the professional markets, I think you can find similarities to certain scientific projects like high energy physics. In high energy physics, you have now experiments that involve 2,000 physicists, last for 20, 30 years. And these 2,000 physicists come from different countries, but not from all over the globe. They come also from Japan, from Europe, and from the US, mostly. And there's a little bit of Greece sometimes, and there's hardly any Africa. So there's hardly any Siberia. So you can see it's even the same sort of global cities that are involved, or global regions that are involved in that. And of course, they communicate via electronic media with each other, but they usually have a center. The center is where when you have a physical reality, like a detector and particles and an accelerator, and all of that is physical and not symbolic, then you can't completely imitate these global markets because they profit from the fact that their transactions, everything, the numbers, the price, the order book, whatever is relevant, the broker, is in a symbolic medium, is electronic. And then you can have this smooth, effective, escaping supervision market going on that you can't even have in physics when you have a physical detector. Because if you have a physical detector, it requires that you travel there physically, that you monitor it, that you repair it, that you maintain it, then you go home again. So it is much more of a different kind of globalization. But in between, it's a collaboratory, an electronic collaboratory that is similar to what you have in these global markets. So they spearhead. I would see them as spearheading an option of globalization that isn't realized everywhere, but that can be realized when you have symbolic transactions and symbolic, when the whole thing has turned informational and symbolic, then you can do it without much of the physical reality except as an infrastructure.
Yes, I think I concur with what Karen just said, and I think that this case, the case we've made for global markets and the new global firm, can be expanded to other domains as well. Usually globalization, or very often if not usually, globalization has been associated with these big global corporations, the emergence of global brands and so on and so forth. But if you shift a little bit the perspective and look at mid-sized or smaller firms, you can find, especially in the IT sector, a lot of similarities where IT firms, and I can name here several concrete examples, are functionally differentiated and spread across the world. Another example is, well, let's give an example closer to our home, academic publishing, where copy editing can be done in one place, in one time zone, and printing in a different time zone, and binding in a different time zone, and the headquarters are in another time zone.
Oxford University.
Yes, that's a good example where you can do the copy editing in India, and I'm serious. And I'm not making this up. And the printing in Singapore, again, I'm not making it up, and then the printed copies are shipped back to the central offices in Oxford. So you can see this spreading out of various activities across time zones.
Let me just add that global climate modeling is a scientific practice that meets this kind of distributed criteria very well at the moment. The final question I want to ask is, what kinds of conceptual, methodological challenges do global markets pose for social science research, for how we're doing it now and how we might do it better in the future?
Well, on a relatively naive level, they pose A, no challenge, and B, a big challenge. No challenge because some of the challenges are simply that you don't get access, So it's not a real epistemological problem. It's a problem of getting on the trading floor. And with algorithms, that problem is algorithmic trading, that problem deepens because the algorithmic trading is an interiorization of the trader into the system of software and so on and so forth. Now, previously, you already had the transaction interiorized. And you have the market, the prices and all that interiorized. What we usually call market is price and order book, interiorized into the, what I call a scopic system. It's part of it. But now the trader is also internalized. The trader is an algorithm. And the human person is watching the algorithms on the screens. Now, when you want to know about trading and the algorithm is not made accessible to you because it's heavily proprietary and costs a lot to change every 3 months, then of course you cannot do the ethnographic observation other than indirectly, by watching what the traders watch, the result of the algorithms. So I was always hoping that there would at some point be someone in the audience who would be an app maker and who would make an algorithm, that could be attached to the trading algorithms and could be an ethnographic algorithm. It watches what they are doing. But nobody ever takes it up. So, I don't know, I will get to the point of trying to do it myself, I think. because so it's not it's a technological challenge, because much of the actual activity that you would like to see a little closer as an ethnographer, you cannot see anymore. It's too fast. It's like in physics particles, they are too fast, they are too dangerous, they are too, you cannot interrupt them, you will kill the market and you will create a flash crash. So you cannot really continue ethnographic observation. But on some level, it's not I was very surprised when I first got on a trading floor. I thought, ooh, this global market and this is globalization, this is big data, big institution, big stuff. What would I do as a microsociologist? I wouldn't see anything. You just step on a trading floor and you see everything. Yeah, it's not a problem. You have to get access, but once you have access, you can observe it wonderfully, like you observed everything else. And because it's such a closed universe, limited, it's easy to observe. They do relatively simplified things. They only make money. It's not true, of course, but on some level they make the same thing, all the time. And it's very exciting, but very observable, as long as human traders trade. When they don't trade, when algorithms trade, it becomes more complicated.
Alex, would you like to jump in?
I think that, yes, I think that on one level, the work we've been doing as ethnographers needs to be revisited in the following sense. Usually, very, very often in any case, ethnographic work has been seen as individual work, and for good reason. But we face now challenges, especially in among others in organizational ethnographies, right? Because we are facing this issue of functionally differentiated, distributed global firms, where it might be more difficult to, not only materially or financially difficult, to do participant observation in various sites. The real methodological challenge here is that the participant observation has to be done in on distributed sites all at once, not consecutively. What I mean to say is the following. Usually this sort of individualized ethnographic work would imply that I spend some time first, let's say, in the offices, management offices, and then I travel over and spend some time with the chief programmers and so on and so forth, and then with the tax lawyers and the tax accountants and so on and so forth, in order to understand the nature of organizational processes. But now the challenge is to have this sort of observations done quasi-simultaneously on several sites which are distributed around the globe, and that would mean rethinking the nature of ethnography, or thinking more seriously about the nature and possibilities of ethnographic teamwork and the possibilities of coordinating ethnographies at different sites and unfolding these ethnographic observations quasi-simultaneously instead of proceeding, as it has often been the case, step by step from observation site to observation site.
Okay, at this point I think it's appropriate to open the floor to questions. And I'll just ask that you step to the microphone that's here in the center so that we can pick up your question on tonight's recording. ahead, Gary.
Interesting presentation, and I just, apropos kind of cyber physical relations on the one hand, kind of digital information technology algorithms, automated social relations, et cetera, and then distributed firms on the other. I was wondering how you observe the following kinds of problems. One is, risk. How are risk calculations within these, both within the markets and within the firms, managed? Often the trajectory and risk analysis has been away from simple reliance on equations and more concern, especially the more complex the systems become, for incident observation and analysis that takes more of the relationality of the points of risk into effect. The second question has to do with are there optimization practices in place, both kind of efficiency questions about the character of trading? Are the firms or the traders or the markets concerned in some way with improving the speed and character and quality of the trading, and how does that kind of reflexive dimension take place? Another way in which you could think about optimization issues has to do with technology itself. How, at what moment and in what way is technological improvement introduced? What role do the hardware producers play? What role do the software producers play? What kind of interaction and relationality exists, and that sort of thing? And then the final thing has to do with regulation. I know that you say that there's kind of remarkable, startling separation between the markets and the government, but there's been quite a bit of, especially transnational discussion of how to regulate financial markets, and there's a lot of creativity around how to do that. And I just wonder if at the ethnographic, I mean, these are big questions, but I just wonder how you address those kinds of things.
Should one? So it's really too big a question. Yeah. Too big the question, and too big. Let me say a few things. First of all, risk. It has to sort of sink into us that these financial markets need risk-taking. So risk is not to be excluded. You need to take risks because that's the way to make money, if you take risks. And therefore, this is always an interesting, ambiguous, and a boundary sort of thing. You have risk units in all these firms, and they, of course, watch some of the output, what positions. Basically, they watch the positions traders take, and then in the professional firms. And then when the positions get out of bounds, are too large or are too negative or too something, then they are supposed to interfere. But neither these units nor the supervisors on the floor, there's usually one supervisor on the floor who also watches the traders' positions, need to interfere. So they have some leeway, and they use the leeway. And the traders may hide their positions, as this London whale, for example, just didn't disclose how deep he was in the minus already. So you have to allow risk-taking, and you have to allow overshooting your limits. But then things like trust come into the picture. Is this a trader I think I can allow to take a larger position or not today? Or do I have to shut them off and send them home and say, come back in 3 days? So that's one way of risk, watching, monitoring, and negotiating implicitly and explicitly. Another is through hedging. The traders themselves hedge their positions. So they take a positive, but they also take a negative position, and they try to remain equal, especially the algorithmic traders. And in the high-frequency case, you try to avoid, having any position that's overnight. You're having any position that might incur risks that you cannot control. So you always try to be fairly even and try to do so-called market making in the sense of gaining money from the spread you get between buying and selling rather than from risk-taking itself. So hedging is another means, and of course there are built into the software, when it is algorithmic trading, they built into the software risk assessments and try to shut the software off when it goes too far. But it goes too far all the time. And risks is on different levels. That's why the question is problematic to answer in one way. I mean, the financial crisis was on some level just taking too many risks. And why did nobody interfere? Because the rating agencies didn't work, for example, didn't assess the risk correctly. Some of the risk assessment was. So these are interesting but deep questions. I'm not sure. Maybe we can pursue it a little later. Could continue with it. To not,
Alex, do you want to take a stab at it?
Very, very
because
shortly
there
on
was a
risk,
question in the back also.
I would add here that risk has also become an entity which is shifted around among traders. I've heard just the other week, actually, somebody here in Chicago, he was a trader, saying that, and I asked him, what makes a good trader? Well, the willingness to take other people's risk. So give me your risk, I'll take care of it, you'll have free books, your books will look good, and I'll get something in return. So risk can be looked at not only as an object of calculation, but also an entity which is shifted around in this world. That was one thing I wanted to add. Now I'd like to come shortly to the second point about this organization practices. Well, it's interesting because efficiency questions now, even in finance, have dressed differently, and the nature of efficiency, what it means to be efficient, is understood in relationship to what kind of trading you're practicing. Algorithmic trading or high-frequency trading have a notion of efficiency or an understanding of efficient trading, which might not be the same with other firms from this domain. So I think very, very little has been done in this respect, even in the domain of finance. What does it mean? What is their self-understanding of efficiency, and what it means for them to be efficient? Of course, if you look at the handbook definition, you have various metrics for efficiency, but that's the handbook situation. It's not the reality. So we need to look here at the reality and see how various understandings of efficiency operate, because there isn't only one, and it might not be the handbook definition. And what sort of tensions and issues might arise from these different understandings. And now finally, with respect to your last question about how to regulate financial markets, we've seen that this has been a very tensioned area for at least the last 20 years. You get attempts after attempts to regulate financial markets, and then you get a new situation where market players try to circumvent, find loopholes, and so on and so forth. So it's been a very tensioned area, as I said. What appears to be the case is that to a large extent, regulation is still practiced either at the level of a nation state, as in the United States, or at the level of a block of states, such as the European Union, but other areas and I mean here also geographic areas are other markets are much less regulated. So that oftentimes when you look at statistics about financial transactions, for instance, you get a series of statistical data for the regulated area, and then an estimate for the unregulated one. And oftentimes the estimate is almost as large as the data for the regulated area, and this indicates you that a lot of activity might take place in quasi-regulated or unregulated financial areas. So what I mean to say here in the end is that indeed this attempt at regulating financial markets has been very tensioned, and the tensions are not are ongoing.
If I can add just one thing, is that this question of regulation should probably not be studied in terms of regulation, because there is some game going on between the regulators and these financial bodies. So the interesting notion here, for example, is the delay you have between a regulation being passed in Congress and it being implemented. And why does it take 5, 6, 7 years? What is going on there? And that delay is legal. That delay is almost required because they need to have hearings about what the other side says. And then they, of course, end up doing nothing, or something else happens in the meantime. And so one has to look at this revolving door between lawyers, at the SEC, and lawyers then acting for the firms against the SEC. One has to look at the game that's being played when things are pushed into the exchange and then dark pools are created. What is that? So you have them in the exchange in order to watch them and regulate them, and then you create dark pools. The exchange creates dark pools in order to take them out of the regulation again. And so we have to have a different approach, conceptual approach to that. We have to find, it doesn't work to think from the state down. That sort of thing just leads to frustration because you feel you are being made fun of, nothing happens. But you need to look at this game that is in place and find concepts for that.
Terry?
There's some overlapping concepts or dichotomies in at least two areas. If you look, say, at sociologists like George Ritzer, he has books on the McDonaldization of the world, how the Hollywoodization, everything is becoming uniform through the globalization process. Versus folks such as the city of Boulder, Colorado, where they say, we refuse to have big box stores because we want local culture, local sensitivity to remain. We prohibit this globalization process to penetrate what we want to see retained here locally. Or among some of the economists and finance people, they'll talk about efficient markets versus less efficient or non-efficient markets. I wonder, the question is there any way that we could begin to, or let me just briefly mention at least the anthropological concept of local knowledge, that it's not just universal, abstract, general, there's something specifically local which is critical to understand what is in people's heads. So these are three kinds of analogous dichotomies. Is there any way that your work on the ethnography of traders, or more generally, could give us a handle on either risk or the margin of profit or the lack of communication, of where and how these two kinds of models work, either in algorithms, or which algorithms try to incorporate or ignore them, but how has local knowledge or the local specificities been built into what are generally universal, standard, global, undifferentiated models? That's the question.
So it's a very good question. I think in one, on one level the answer is easy. The local knowledge is now internal to these global cultures, if you wish, to these global communities. They have local knowledge, but it's not local in a territorial sense. Local means part of their universe of doing things in their practices, localized in their practices, but not territorially local. It is distributed, but it's limited to these communities and the outside world. And there is no understanding. This non-understanding of Wall Street and Main Street is a very real thing. That Wall Street doesn't understand what Main Street wants. And so That's one answer. The other answer is that there are really, we cannot only think globalization in terms of territorially local or territorially global. I tend to look at these markets more in terms of question of synchronization and desynchronization. So they started out relatively local. They became globally synchronized. And again, I must say it depends on the market. When you look at retail traders or stock market, it looks different. So then they became globally synchronized, you know, including the body of the trader. Everything was synchronized. Now it's again much more desynchronized with multiple platforms and multiple locations of servers and so on and so forth. But this is not going back to the local. It's going back to a technical desynchronization, if you wish, so that you have different pieces, maybe in different places, but speedily interconnected. So as if they were not in different places. So the dimension is a different one. It's not just local and global territorially speaking, but also synchronized versus desynchronized without involving necessarily the locals. You can be desynchronized, but it's not localized. So the glocalization notion, the Peterson notion of glocalization, doesn't really fit that well what's going on in some of these markets. But the retail case, again, may be different.
Well, I would like to add here very shortly the following. First of all, I would distinguish between local knowledge and this sort of situational knowledge. Local can be understood as local knowledge in a particular spatial setting, but we also have situational knowledge which can be understood as the kind of experience-based knowledge, not always explicit, enabling actors or participants to deal with action in a particular situation they are in. And with respect to this distinction between local knowledge and situational knowledge, I would say the following way. While debates about globalization and localization have tended to highlight a lot the role of local knowledge, much less attention has been paid to this situational knowledge. It might also play a role in this respect. And now, having said this, I'd like to go back to your initial question. How does this work, ethnographic work, help us understand better issues like risk or margin of profit? In my case at least, my ethnographic work has helped me understand in the first place is how little economically educated market players, how little attention and significance they assign to textbook notions and prescriptions and how to calculate profits, how this should be done, and how they actually should follow particular preset steps in these apparently simple and standardized procedures. There is a huge gap here, if you want to put it like this, between the situational knowledge and the situational challenges faced by a broker in calculating profit by the minute, because they need to do that, and the margin of profit by the minute on the one hand, and this kind of standardized accounting prescriptions and economics prescriptions about how what profit is and how profits should be calculated. While the first, the standardized view is seen as unproblematic and as self-evident, in practice you can see that market actors, even those who are fully educated in economics, right, face a whole lot of uncertainties about what profit should be in particular situations and how much how contentious that is and how much they draw upon their experience and this kind of situational knowledge in order to face these issues. So if I were to take it from there, I would say the following. If you can if you regard, well, this kind of standardized economics knowledge as a sort of globalized knowledge, because it has been globalized to a very large extent. It's the dominant orthodox view in economics and accounting. You can see here clashes with situational forms of knowledge which either ignore or run counter this particular type of global economic knowledge or global accounting knowledge.
We have time for one more question. I know you've been very patient in the front row.
Thanks.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, me or yeah, okay, yes. So, sorry, I know there's a lot of people with questions. I just wanted to return to the first question you asked, which is about the state. So, I mean, I kind of got the impression from the two of you that in these global financial markets that the state is not playing that large of a role. Perhaps a large role, perhaps some of a role in equity markets and stock markets, but certainly less in currency markets. And I certainly agree with that kind of general idea that the state does have a surprisingly small role in over-the-counter currency markets. That said, as someone who always wants to kind of like return to this idea that states do have a large role in our lives, including financial markets, there's at least two ways that I think of as quite important for the role of the state in currency markets. One is that we must not forget capital controls, right? So capital controls are just any kind of way that the state can slow down capital, and this will certainly affect what traders are allowed to trade, the circumstances of it, the liquidity of it. A classic example of that is the Tobin tax. Once again, even in our own country, people are now talking about this possibility. Capital controls with the possibility of Greece leaving the euro were also raised. A second way is that, yes, these traders are working in over-the-counter markets, but they are also working for corporations, large corporations that are, I'm thinking of the institutional traders.
Mm-hmm.
And these banks are located in particular countries, and they are subject to the licensing and regulations of those countries. And so this is also a way that we can influence financial markets. That's just a comment that you can comment back on. And I also just have a broad question, which is, both of you had talked earlier about kind of like wrestling with this issue of regulation. Karen, I mentioned about kind of like that thinking about regulation as top down is very problematic. I certainly agree with that. So skipping this idea of regulation, looking more at public policy, I was just thinking, what are some of the implications of your research for public policy broadly? Thanks.
So the first was more of a comment, and I fully agree that the state is on some level in the picture, must license banks. But one should never forget that the state also, this kind of state we have today, this kind of economy needs financial markets, because financial markets are about credit, and we need credit. And financial markets mobilize credit. If we would go back to not wanting credit, I say go back because there was a time when we didn't have it to the same degree, that would change the whole economy majorly. And so there's always that depending on them and trying to regulate them at the same time. But the question of corporations so your last question was, what was the last question you asked?
The actual question was just kind of where some of the
or how, what can you, what were the implications for public policy? Of course, lots of people have thought about that. They have come up with mechanisms like the Tobin tax and this and that. All of these mechanisms have always also unintended consequences, possible unintended consequences. There are areas where I think we haven't, about which we haven't talked much. For example, in my understanding of this sort of institutional trading, given how speedily it proceeds, even before algorithms, there is almost total synchronization between the trader and the market. You strap yourself to your seat, you are in the market, you feel it bodily. That means all the processing you're doing is really implicit processing. It's not prefrontal cortex. It's your implicit processing circuits. You have to do it almost quasi-automatically. And they train themselves to be able to do it quasi-automatically, but that means that there are a lot of phenomenological subtractions, meaning a lot of things are not in the implicit processing awareness and cannot get into it. You are fully preoccupied with the flow of the sort of trading you have to do and watching you have to do. And therefore, implications of these markets, hurtful things they are doing, destructiveness of these markets is not in the awareness of your action. And what can you do about that? I mean, either you get rid of the whole technology. It doesn't really help to train people in the evening or on the weekend about some of these things, because once they are in the market, they really function with the market. They go with it. They go with the flow. But one thing you could do, for example, is place on their screen, constantly, implications of what they have just done. It would have to be in that medium. They would have to encounter it in the medium, not outside the medium. Outside the medium, they cannot function at all. Outside the medium, they're just doing nonsense, drinking and, car driving, and because they are also tired. They are killed. They are finished. When you do that 12 hours a day, you cannot really spend attention on anything. So you have to think about, are we going to work with the technology, and how can we use it to increase their awareness of the consequences, to modify the subtractions which are in the system would be a way of thinking about some of the consequences of the things we find out on the micro level, rather than on the macro level thinking, okay, how can I invent another tax to deal with the problem, which is the usual state reaction. It's not always a useful reaction, but at certain points in time it can. And when we look at the state, we also have to look at central banks. They are sometimes much more important for these markets. For example, in Switzerland, they practically fixed the currency in the last 3 years. But it wasn't the state doing anything. It was the central bank just buying and selling into the currency moves such that the relationship between the Swiss franc and the euro and the dollar was stabilized, because they were concerned about the economy. If it would have gone out of pounds, that would have been very disastrous for the economy. So I would look at particular agencies that are not necessarily state agencies and what they are doing. And I would target the central banks more, because they are playing some of these, limiting games and enhancing games. And I don't want to call all of these games. They are not games, but they are having instruments, some instruments at least, to do things that the state is not doing, that go beyond taxing, simply taxing.
Just very shortly, with respect to the issue of capital controls, there was the other day a very interesting article in the New York Times about, how wealthy Chinese citizens avoid the rather strict capital controls imposed by the government, namely through the practice of smurfing, which is quite relevant, right? China has strict capital controls. You cannot transfer via bank transfer, wire transfer outside the country more than $50,000 per year, I think. And what the Chinese citizens, what they have to do is find the adequate number of friends, 10, 15, 20, and so on and so forth, give each $50,000, have them transferred in their account overseas, and that's it. The takeaway point here is that these reactions to controls or to regulations are rather strategic and opportunistic in nature, and then you attempt to impose, as we see here, a rather strict regulatory measure will be likely to trigger attempts at finding loopholes and at finding ways of circumventing that measure in to the effect that the state regulatory response would probably be to impose even another measure, which will trigger in its turn attempts again at finding yet another loophole and yet another attempt to circumvent it, and so on and so forth. What I mean to say here is the following, and this I think is a very important point in designing regulatory measures like this. One should start from the premise, in the design, or should embed in the design the expectation of a strategic and opportunistic reaction to that measure. Oftentimes, this hasn't been the case, even in the recent past. Regulatory measures have been more than once designed without taking into account what sort of response that will trigger, in the expectation that everybody will obey and submit to that measure. But we see all too often that this is not the case, as I mentioned.
Okay. On that note, I would like to invite everyone to continue the conversation over drinks in the next room and to thank our speakers, please.
Thank you.